How did your parents treat your siblings when you weren't around? The first thing I noticed when I walked through my parents' front door after 14 months away was that my brother Nico's bedroom door was padlocked from the outside. Not a hook latch, not a sliding bolt, a padlock, the kind with a combination dial, the kind you put on a storage unit. I stood in the hallway with my duffel bag still on my shoulder and looked at that padlock for probably 10 seconds before my mother appeared from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel and said, "Welcome home," in the voice she used when she was managing a situation rather than feeling it. I asked her what the lock was for. She said Nico had been going through a difficult period and they had needed to establish some structure. I asked where Nico was. She said he was at a program. I asked what kind of program. She said a therapeutic one. She said it in the tone that communicates that the word therapeutic is meant to end a conversation rather than begin one. I set my bag down. I looked at the lock. I thought about my brother, who was 15 years old and who I had left 14 months ago as a kid who built model trains in his room and watched too much television and asked too many questions about everything. And I thought, something is very wrong here. I had been working on a commercial fishing boat in Alaska for 14 months, which is one of those jobs that sounds adventurous when you describe it to people at parties and feels mostly like exhaustion and logistics when you're actually doing it. I was 22, had dropped out of community college after a semester of profound uncertainty about what I wanted from my life, and had taken the fishing job because a friend of a friend offered it, and it paid well and got me away from a situation at home that I had not fully understood was a situation at the time. My family was my parents, Deborah and Conrad, and my brother Nico, who is 7 years younger than me. Deborah was a dental office administrator, and Conrad worked in commercial insurance, and they were the kind of parents who attended church regularly and had a clean house and talked about family values at dinner and were, from the outside, indistinguishable from every other functional suburban family on their street. The things I had noticed growing up that didn't quite fit the picture, the way Conrad's mood could shift without visible cause, the specific quality of silence that settled over a room when he was displeased, the way Deborah's energy oriented itself entirely around managing his, I had filed under difficult personality and complicated family dynamics and had not yet found the language to call something more specific. I had left for Alaska partly because I needed money, and partly because the atmosphere of that house had been pressing on me in a way I could feel in my chest and couldn't name. I left Nico there. That is the part I have to live with. The first conversation with my mother lasted about 20 minutes and yielded very little useful information. She said Nico had been struggling with behavioral issues that had escalated to a point where they had needed professional intervention. She said the program was helping him. She said he would be home in a few weeks. She said Conrad was handling most of the coordination with the program and I should talk to him when he got back from work. She made dinner and we ate it and she asked about the fishing and I gave her short answers and I watched her face for information and what I got was the practiced blankness of someone who has been presenting a version of things for so long that the presentation has become its own kind of reality. That night I went to my old bedroom and lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the padlock. Padlocks on bedroom doors from the outside do not indicate therapeutic intervention. They indicate containment. They are a feature of the before, not the after. I called Nico's school the next morning while my parents were at work. I had his school's number in my phone from before I left. I had called him there once when his cell phone wasn't working, and I asked for his homeroom teacher, a woman named Ms. Anitha Prasad, who had been his teacher for the current year. She came on the line, and when I said I was Nico's older brother calling to check in, she went very quiet in a way that was not the quiet of someone with nothing to say. She said she was glad I had called. She said she had been concerned about Nico for several months and had been trying to reach the family. She said his attendance had been extremely irregular since September and that when he was present, he seemed withdrawn and had lost a significant amount of weight and had told her on one occasion that he wasn't sleeping well. She said she had filed a concern report with the school counselor in October and another in November and had been told both times that the family was working with an external provider and the situation was being managed. She said she had heard he was now in a program and she asked if I knew which one. I said I was trying to find out. She said, "Please call me back when you know more." She said it in the tone of someone who has been waiting for a specific phone call for a long time. Conrad came home at 6:15, and I was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for him. He looked at me when he came through the door with the particular expression he had always used with me, a mixture of assessment and mild irritation, as though my presence represented a scheduling complication, and then he sat down across from me and told me about the program. It was called Clearwater Path, a residential therapeutic program about 2 hours from our house, and he had enrolled Nico there in January after what he described as a serious incident at home involving Nico's defiant and erratic behavior. He used the phrase erratic behavior 3 times. He said the program specialized in adolescents with behavioral and emotional challenges, and that it was fully licensed and had excellent reviews. He said Nico was making progress. He said I should trust the process. I asked if I could call Nico. Conrad said contact during the first phase of the program was restricted to maintain therapeutic focus. I asked what the first phase meant in terms of duration. He said it varied depending on progress. He said it in the way that means, I am not going to give you a specific answer, and I am signaling that you should stop asking. I looked at him across the kitchen table and thought about a padlock and a school teacher who had been trying to reach the family, and I nodded and said, okay, and went to my room and got on my laptop. I spent 3 hours that night looking up Clearwater Path. The website was professional and warm and full of photographs of teenagers doing outdoor activities and talking in circle groups with kind-faced adults. The licensing information cited a state certification from 2 years ago. The reviews on Google were mixed in a way that made my stomach tighten. Several glowing testimonials that read like they had been written by the same person, and 3 reviews that had been responded to with the specific corporate smoothness of someone managing a reputation. And 1 review buried at the bottom with a low rating that said, they isolated my son from our family for months, and when we finally got him out, he needed real therapy to recover from what they did there. 1 review. But the language of it, isolated, months, recover from what they did, sat in me and would not move. I looked up the licensing certification body and found that the certification was current, but had been issued under a different program name that had changed following a complaint investigation 2 years prior. The complaint was not public record, but the name change was. I wrote everything down in a notebook. Then I went to sleep and did not sleep well. The next morning, I called Anitha Prasad back and told her what I had found about the program. She was quiet again, and then she said she wanted to give me the number of the school counselor who had been handling Nico's case. The counselor's name was Mr. Dion Achebe, and he had been with the school district for 11 years and had a manner of speaking that was careful and specific, the way people speak when they understand that words have consequences. He confirmed that he had received 2 concern reports about Nico, both from Ms. Prasad, and that he had followed up with my parents both times and had been told the family was utilizing outside support. He said that residential therapeutic programs for adolescents existed on a wide spectrum of quality and approach, and that some programs in the category informally known as troubled teen programs had documented histories of harmful practices. He said he could not speak to this specific program. He said he strongly encouraged me to make contact with Nico directly if possible and to consult with an attorney if I had concerns about the placement. He gave me the name of an organization that did advocacy work for youth in residential programs. He said, your instincts about this are worth listening to. I called the advocacy organization that afternoon. It was called the Youth Residential Safety Network, and the woman who answered was a volunteer named Cecily Odom, who had been doing this work for 8 years and who spoke with the particular combination of warmth and controlled fury of someone who has heard many versions of this story and has not become numb to it. I told her what I knew. She asked me a series of questions. What state the program was in, what the enrollment process had looked like, whether my parents had been the ones to initiate the placement, or whether they had been referred by someone, whether Nico had been transported to the program, or whether he had gone voluntarily. I didn't know the answers to most of these. She said that programs that restricted contact with family members during an undefined first phase, combined with a history of operating under a different name following a complaint, were significant warning flags. She said the category of program I was describing, private residential therapeutic programs with limited outside oversight, was one of the least regulated spaces in the country for minors. She said she was going to email me a list of questions to ask and a legal contact in my state who specialized in this area. The email arrived 12 minutes later. I printed it out and held the pages and felt the particular quality of someone who has been looking at a wall for a long time and has just found the door. The legal contact was an attorney named Philippa Nkosi, who had been practicing family law and educational rights for 15 years with a specific focus on residential placement cases. I called her office at 9 o'clock the following morning, and she answered personally, which surprised me, and she listened to everything I described in the organized sequence I had prepared the night before. She asked clarifying questions, made notes, and then said several things in order. First, as a sibling rather than a parent, I had no automatic legal standing to compel contact with Nico or to challenge his placement. Second, if I had evidence that the program was operating in a harmful manner or that Nico had been placed there inappropriately, there were legal avenues available, but they required documentation. Third, she wanted to see everything I had found about the program's history, including the name change and the complaint record. She said she would do her own research and call me back within 24 hours. She said, document every conversation you have with your parents about this from this point forward. She said, don't tell them you've consulted a lawyer yet. I said I understood. She said, I want to be clear about something. The fact that your parents enrolled your brother in a program does not mean that program is appropriate or safe. Parents make placement decisions that harm their children. It happens more often than most people understand. She called back in 18 hours. The name change I had found was connected to a complaint filed by 2 families whose children had been at the program during its previous iteration, alleging physical restraint practices and isolation protocols that exceeded licensing guidelines. The complaint had resulted in a corrective action plan rather than revocation of the license, and the program had rebranded and continued operating. There was a second document she had found, a state inspection report from 8 months ago that had noted several deficiencies in contact policy compliance, specifically that the program's restriction of family communication was not consistently documented or justified in individual treatment plans as required by state regulations. The inspection had resulted in a written notice of non-compliance. The program had submitted a corrective response that the state had accepted. The deficiencies were on record. I sat at the kitchen table reading this on my phone while my mother made coffee 6 feet away, and I kept my face completely neutral and said nothing. I went to see Nico. I drove 2 hours to the address I had looked up for Clearwater Path, which was a converted ranch property on a county road with a chain-link fence around the perimeter and a sign at the entrance with a stylized logo. I told the person at the gate that I was Nico's sibling and had driven from out of state and wanted to see him. She told me visitor access required advanced scheduling through the family coordinator and parental authorization for family members other than parents. I said I understood and asked for the family coordinator's contact information and the name of Nico's assigned counselor. She gave me a brochure and said all contact information was on the website. I took the brochure and drove to the nearest gas station and sat in my car and called Philippa Nkosi. She said the visitor restriction policy I had just encountered was consistent with the non-compliance notice regarding contact policy. She said she was filing a formal inquiry with the state's licensing office and requesting Nico's treatment plan documentation, which the program was required to provide to certain parties under state law. She said, "I need you to do something today. I need you to go back to your parents' house and find anything that documents how and why Nico was placed there. Any paperwork they signed, any communications with the program, any assessment that recommended the placement." I said I would try. She said, "This is important. The documentation of the intake process may tell us whether proper protocols were followed." I drove back to my parents' house, and I want to be honest about what the next part required of me, which was a deliberate decision to search through my parents' private documents while they were not home. I am not going to pretend this was comfortable or that I have no ambivalence about it. I knew it was the right thing, and I did it anyway, which is a combination that doesn't always feel clean. I found what I was looking for in Conrad's home office, in a file folder labeled Nico Clearwater in the second drawer of his filing cabinet. Inside were the enrollment paperwork, a signed authorization form, a document called an initial assessment referral signed by a therapist named Dr. Harold Jenks, and 2 pieces of correspondence between Conrad and the program's director that I photographed with my phone. The correspondence was what mattered. In the first email, dated December of the previous year, Conrad had described Nico's behavior in terms that escalated significantly beyond anything I recognized. Language about aggression and instability and inability to function in a household that read less like a parent describing a struggling teenager and more like someone building a case. The second email, from the program director, had said they could accommodate Nico beginning in January and had attached a fee schedule showing a monthly cost of $6,200 covered by an insurance policy I had not known my parents held. I photographed everything, put it back exactly as I found it, and texted Philippa Nkosi from my car outside. She called me within the hour, and I read her the relevant parts of the emails. There was a silence, and then she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it as honestly as you can. Based on what you know of your brother before you left, does the description Conrad gave in that email match what you observed of him?" I thought about Nico, about the model trains, about the way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, about the specific ordinary normality of a 14-year-old kid in a house that was sometimes tense but was not, had not been, what Conrad's email described. I said no. She said, "That matters. A placement predicated on a significantly inaccurate characterization of a minor's behavior raises serious questions about whether the placement was appropriate and whether the professional who issued the referral had adequate basis for doing so." She said she was requesting Dr. Harold Jenks's licensing information and would be looking at the assessment documentation. She also said she had received a preliminary response from the state licensing office and that her inquiry had been escalated to a field investigation unit based on the existing non-compliance record. The field investigator was a woman named Specialist Renata Holbrook, who had been with the state's residential program oversight division for 9 years and who called me 3 days after Philippa filed the inquiry. She was professional and specific and had clearly already reviewed the program's file before contacting me. She said she was scheduling an unannounced inspection of Clearwater Path and that as part of her investigation, she needed to interview Nico directly. She said that under state law, children in residential programs had the right to speak privately with state investigators regardless of the program's contact policies. She said the inspection would happen within the week. She said I could not be present, but that she would follow up with Philippa Nkosi after the inspection was complete. I asked her what she expected to find. She paused and then said, "I can tell you that the combination of contact restriction, existing non-compliance history, and the enrollment documentation you've described is a pattern I've seen before. I don't want to characterize the outcome before I've done the inspection, but I want you to know we take this seriously. My parents found out I had been to the program 4 days after I went, when the family coordinator apparently contacted them to report that an unauthorized family member had attempted a visit. Conrad came to me that evening, and his expression was the one I had grown up being afraid of. Not loud, not dramatic, just a specific compression of the face that communicated that he had made a calculation, and the calculation had concluded I had made a serious error. He said I had overstepped in a way that could harm Nico's progress. He said I did not understand the situation and had no standing to interfere. He said if I continued to involve myself, he would ask me to leave the house. I listened to all of this, and I thought about Renata Holbrook and the inspection that was 4 days away, and I thought about Philippa Nicosi's instruction to document everything. I said I was sorry for causing him concern. He looked at me for a long moment with the face of someone who is trying to determine if an answer is genuine. Then he went to his room. I recorded the conversation on my phone from the moment he had started talking. I sent the audio file to Philippa Nicosi at 9:45 that night. She called me at 7:30 the following morning to tell me that Dr. Harold Jenks, who had issued the referral assessment for Nico's placement, had been the subject of a prior licensing complaint related to assessments used in residential program referrals, and that the complaint was currently under review by the state licensing board. She said the complaint had been filed by another family in a situation similar to Nico's. She said this did not yet constitute proof of wrongdoing, but that the pattern, a therapist with a referral complaint history connected to a program with a non-compliance history, was something the field investigation would take seriously. She said, "I want you to be prepared for this to move quickly once the inspection happens. If Renata Holbrook finds what I think she's going to find, the program will be under significant pressure and your parents may be contacted by the licensing office." She said, "How are you doing?" It was a question I was not expecting, and it took me a moment to answer honestly. I said, "I left him here." She said, "You didn't know." I said, "I should have known." She said, "That's for later. Right now, let's get him home." The inspection happened on a Thursday. Renata Holbrook called Philippa Nicosi that evening, and Philippa called me at 8:15 p.m. She said the inspection had found multiple violations. Nico had been interviewed privately and had disclosed that he had been placed in isolation, described by the program as reflection time, on 4 separate occasions for periods ranging from 4 hours to 1 full day, in a room with no outside windows. He had disclosed that his personal communication device had been confiscated on enrollment and that he had had no contact with anyone outside the program, including me, since January. He had been told that his family had agreed to these restrictions as part of the treatment plan. He had not been told that state law gave him the right to speak with a state investigator. Renata Holbrook had documented all of this in a preliminary incident report and had cited the program with 4 regulatory violations, 2 of which were classified as serious. She had also requested an emergency review of Nico's continued placement. Philippa said, "This is moving now." She said the state could not force my parents to remove Nico from the program, but that the violations created significant legal and regulatory pressure on the program itself, and that the combination of the violations and the referral concerns about Dr. Jenks gave her grounds to pursue an emergency family court filing challenging the appropriateness of the placement. She said the filing would need to happen within 48 hours to be effective before the emergency review concluded. She said, "I need your authorization to file." I said, "File." My parents were served with the court papers on a Friday afternoon. I was at the kitchen table when my mother opened the envelope, and I watched her face go through the specific sequence of someone reading something that contradicts the version of events they have been maintaining. She sat down heavily in a chair. Conrad came into the kitchen and she handed him the papers, and I watched him read, and I watched his face go through a different sequence. Not confusion, but calculation. The specific recalibration of someone who has been caught at something and is assessing options. He looked at me and said, "You did this." I said, "Yes." He said, "You have no idea what you've done." I said, "I think I do." He started to say something else, and then he stopped. And the thing that stopped him was the specific clarity of someone who has run out of ways to frame the situation to their advantage. He went to his office and closed the door, and I heard him on the phone, and Deborah sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands, and neither of us said anything for a very long time. The emergency family court hearing was held 5 days later. Philippa appeared on my behalf. The program's attorney appeared on behalf of Clearwater Path. My parents' attorney appeared on their behalf. Renata Holbrook submitted her inspection report as a formal exhibit. Dr. Jenks's licensing situation was referenced in Philippa's filing. The judge reviewed the inspection violations, the contact restriction documentation, the enrollment correspondence I had photographed, and Renata Holbrook's interview notes from her conversation with Nico. The judge asked the program's attorney specific questions about the isolation protocols and received answers that the inspection report directly contradicted. The hearing lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the judge issued a temporary order requiring Nico to be transferred to an independent evaluation facility within 72 hours, pending a full review of the placement. She cited the inspection violations and the referral concerns as the basis for the order. She also appointed a guardian ad litem, an independent advocate for Nico named Counselor Yemi Adeyemi, who had been working in child advocacy for 12 years, to represent his interests through the remainder of the proceedings. I drove to the evaluation facility the day Nico arrived. He came through the door in a sweatshirt that was too big for him, and he was thin in the way that is different from ordinary thinness, the thinness of someone whose body has been under sustained stress for a long time. He saw me and went still for a moment, and then he walked over and put his head against my shoulder, and I put my arms around him, and neither of us said anything at all. He smelled like institutional soap, and he was shaking slightly, the way people shake when something held very tightly is finally allowed to release. I held on, and I thought about a padlock on a bedroom door, and a school teacher who had been trying to reach the family for months, and an attorney who said this is moving now, and I thought about 14 months in Alaska, and the weight of not knowing what I did not know. Then Nico pulled back and looked at me and said, "You came back." I said, "I came back." He said, "I didn't know if anyone was going to come." I said, "I know. I'm sorry it took this long." He nodded and looked at the floor, and then looked back at me, and the look had something in it I recognized from his face when he was small, the specific expression of someone deciding to trust again after having been given reasons not to. He said, "Can we get food somewhere that isn't that place?" I said, "Absolutely yes." The months that followed were complicated in the way that real outcomes are complicated, not clean, not resolved in a single moment, but accumulating slowly into something that finally looks like solid ground. Clearwater Path was placed under a corrective action plan that suspended new enrollments pending a full licensing review. The review ultimately resulted in the program's license being placed on probation for 18 months with mandatory third-party monitoring. Dr. Harold Jenks's licensing case concluded with a formal censure and a requirement for supervised practice for 2 years, based on a finding that his referral assessments in multiple cases had not met the professional standard of care. Philip Nkosi filed a civil complaint on my behalf and on Nico's behalf related to the program's contact policy violations and isolation practices. The complaint was settled 14 months later, the terms of which I cannot fully disclose, though I will say the settlement was meaningful and that a portion of it was placed in a trust for Nico's ongoing therapeutic needs. My parents retained custody of Nico throughout the proceedings because a placement challenge is not a custody challenge, and because the bar for removing custody from parents who have made a poor placement decision rather than directly abused their child is high and was not met in this case. I want to be honest about this because I know people will ask, they were not charged with abuse. The judge in the family court proceedings found that while their enrollment decision had been poorly made and the program had operated in violation of Nico's rights, there was insufficient evidence that my parents had been aware of the specific violations or had intended harm. What I believe, based on what I know of my father, is more complicated than what could be proven in a courtroom, and I have had to learn to live in the gap between those two things. What I can tell you is that Counselor Yemi Adeyemi remained active in Nico's case for 18 months, that her oversight created external accountability in a situation that had previously had none, and that this mattered in ways I am still grateful for. Nico is 17 now. He lives in my apartment, not because a court order placed him there, but because 6 months after his return home, it became clear that the home he had returned to was not a place where he was healing, and because my parents, in a moment I did not expect and still do not entirely understand, agreed to a voluntary arrangement that placed Nico in my care. I think they made this decision for reasons that included some genuine recognition that they had failed him, and others that are less generous, and I have decided it does not matter much why they made it as long as they made it. He sees a therapist named Dr. Wambui Kariuki every week, a woman with 14 years of experience in adolescent trauma who I found through Yemi Adeyemi's referral network, and who is, I will say plainly, one of the most skilled people I have ever encountered. He is back in school. He is building a model train layout that takes up most of the living room floor. He asked me last month if I was staying, meaning was I going back to Alaska or somewhere far away. I said no. He nodded and went back to what he was doing, and I stood in the doorway of my own apartment, looking at my brother laying track on the carpet, and thought about how close it had been. How if I had come home a year later, or if I had accepted the first set of answers, or if Anitha Prasad had not kept filing concern reports that no one responded to, how different everything might look right now. He is here. He is building something. That has to be enough, and it is enough, and I will not stop being grateful that it is.